Becoming state-proof. That's what we're going to be talking about today with David Ansara, who's the chief executive of the Free Market Foundation. He gave a talk yesterday in downtown Johannesburg in the CBD at the old Rand Club that people of my generation will remember. And it was one of those that demanded, I hope received, a standing ovation. We're going to talk to him in a moment. David, good to be talking with you. Did you get a standing ovation to your talk?
Well, there was some polite applause from the audience, but also some very welcome interrogation of some of the ideas that are put forward. I think always welcome that, I must say. It's good to have, as they say in South Africa, a robust engagement over some of the ideas that we put forward at the Free Market Foundation.
Okay, well, and the occasion?
So the Rand Club has actually gone through something of a renaissance in recent years, and they have a regular meeting called Off the Record. This invitation came from Lucky Dinake, who is the chairman of the membership committee. And I must say the Rand Club is a fantastic institution. It's good to see it growing and really a center of excellence in downtown Johannesburg.
Well, nice to hear that there is a centre of excellence somewhere in that part of the country. But as one goes through the speech, which I read today in its entirety, there's so much we could talk about, but I really want to focus on making yourself state-proof. There were some practical ideas there, some insights that are useful to all members of South African society, and some pretty controversial suggestions to those who, I guess, some might even see it as sedition. You know, don't pay more tax than you have to pay, etc. Maybe we can start there. We can start on the whole state-proof idea. I remember talking to the guys at Sakalika about this a while ago, and you give them credit in your speech as well. When did you stumble onto this idea that being state-proof in a failing state is actually the only rational course of action?
So, Alec, one of the paradoxes that I point out in the speech is that as state capacity diminishes and the capability of the state to administer basic services, to maintain law and order, to uphold the rule of law, but really the core functions of a state, like the real basics, as that begins to break down, we simultaneously also see the expansion of the state, that the state is trying to involve itself in more and more domains. You think economic policy, industrial policy is very interventionist. We have a lot of subsidies and trade barriers, and also a raft of regulations in the labor market. We have BEE, which puts huge burden on businesses. And we see more and more of this expansion, but the state is really not able to perform even the simple core functions that in any normal democratic state that you would have. So this represents, in some respects, this expansion, a threat to the interests of ordinary South Africans, to individuals. We have policies on the legislative agenda like national health insurance. There's expropriation without compensation, which is going to undermine private property rights. So all of these things are actually a threat to the fundamental rights of individuals, their ability to be free. You had Neil Emmerich, an associate of the FMF, on your show last week, talking about the Economic Freedom of the World report. South Africa's ranking is slipping down there. So that actually, because the state has taken on more and more of these functions, that actually represents potentially very harmful consequences. So you need to protect your interests. You need to be realistic about the state's intentions. The state is not just this neutral actor. It is a set of competing interest groups, which is often actively hostile, particularly to the private sector, profit motive, and the basic ingredients that you need to have a prosperous market-driven society. So this idea of state-proofing is also about recognizing that the state is not a neutral actor. It is actually, in many respects, a malevolent actor. You need to protect your assets, your way of life, and your property from some of those malevolent actions. So that's the idea of state-proofing. There's something that was a term that was coined by Sakalika, as you as you rightly point out, and which I mentioned in the speech. So we can maybe go through some of those if you like.
Yeah, there's quite a few practical suggestions. And let's start with the one of avoid paying more taxes than you absolutely have to. Now, that sounds almost unpatriotic to some people, but when I reflected on that, a lot of our taxes are being stolen. The Zondo Commission tells us that. A lot of them are being abused and wasted. We can just have a look at the budget deficit, which is going to grow exponentially rather, in the next few years, as we know, the national debt, etc. So it's not such a bad idea. Give these guys less money, and maybe then that will discipline them. But I guess you're not looking at it from the disciplining of the state perspective, but from the individual, from the rational individual's approach to it.
Yeah, the basic assumption of that social contract is that taxpayers pay their money and they get services in return, and that those resources, there's a burden of responsibility on the state to manage those resources judiciously and effectively. We are a very long way off from that. So depriving the state of resources is very effective leverage for individuals and companies as well to drain power away from the state. So as I stressed in the speech, we're not advocating for people to break the law, but within the bounds of the law to lower their tax exposure as much as possible. You're a business owner. I'm sure many of your viewers own a business. Something that you could easily do is incorporate a holding company in a jurisdiction like Mauritius, which has a double taxation agreement with South Africa. They have a 15% corporate tax rate. Through clever structuring, you can lower your tax exposure. We're also talking about, say, for example, at the local government level, ratepayers associations increasingly taking powers away from municipalities, particularly dysfunctional municipalities. And we see many rural municipalities in arrears to Eskom for billions of rands. They don't have any capability really to pay back those arrears. And so, but ratepayers are suffering because there's sewage running down the street and the street lights aren't working and the potholes are growing. So what we're advocating for is, instead of this kind of sense of despair and hopelessness that tends to engulf many people, the state is failing in its basic functions. What can we do? There's nothing really we can do. We're encouraging individuals, businesses, and communities to take it upon themselves to start providing some of these services. I mentioned organizations like Solidarity, AfriForum, Sakeliga. These are all groups that at the local level are starting to solve problems themselves. They're not waiting for somebody else to come and save them.
I now live in Hermanus in the Western Cape, and I've been here for 10 months. And we've had two disastrous natural occurrences, the most recent just in the last few days, where literally bridges were washed away. When Mother Nature gets cross, boy, she shows it to you. I was just thinking, again, reflecting on this, about what if something like this had happened, say, in the Eastern Cape? It's unlikely that you would have got things back to normal for a long, long time. So where you do have decent governance, and the Western Cape, and certainly here in Hermanus, the local authority, the Overstrand Authority, are on top of things, then I guess you would not advocate what you're saying now, that you would not support them with your taxes or with your rates at a local level anyway.
Yeah, look, I think we also have to be frank about where many of the social and economic problems in South Africa originate from. And the title of my talk was "The Centre Cannot Hold." And as I argued, the characteristic of politics in South Africa over the last 100 years or so has been this dominance of the centre. So politicians and bureaucrats in Pretoria essentially dictate policy to the rest of the country. And so a key theme that we at the Free Market Foundation are advocating is that of political decentralization, so that local governments, provincial governments, and other entities are held directly accountable by the citizens in their immediate regional or geographic jurisdiction, and that there is a very clear link between ratepayers, taxpayers, and their elected officials. At the moment, that link is broken. We have a breakdown in accountability. Democracy is not just only about regular elections, it's also about those accountability mechanisms. So yes, I think it is important to have mechanisms in place collectively to be able to deal with external problems like floods and so on. But that doesn't necessarily have to be the state that provides that. I mean, we saw during the July 2021 riots in KZN, you originate from, the state was entirely absent. There was mass breakdown of social order, but then we had neighborhoods, communities coming together to protect their assets, and there was unfortunately a lot of loss of life and damaged property there. But the state was nowhere to be seen. And so I think taking that idea forward, as the state collapses, what we are seeing is this void that is being created. And nature abhors a vacuum, and that can be filled by criminal syndicates or other chaotic elements, or it could be filled by a more structured, orderly alternative. And I think it's incumbent on us South Africans to start thinking very creatively about how we create those alternative forms of order.
You do say get involved. You do say support civic society organizations, and you mentioned them earlier, Free Market Foundation, your own, Sakeliga, IRR, Solidarity, AfriForum, Outer, Gift to the Givers, and quote, dozens of others, as you said in your speech, who the work off limited budgets. That's kind of a given. But one of the parts that I loved about your address was, and I'm going to read it to you, and I'd like you to just expand on it. We are governed by our inferiors. All the power they have is the power we perceive them to have. It is not real. Now, there are a lot of people who are saying, sure, that kind of breaks a paradigm that they've believed in for many years.
Yeah, so I think this actually speaks to the role of civil society and think tanks like the Free Market Foundation. And I think for many decades, the Free Market Foundation did excellent work advocating for policy reform, for changes, lobbying government to try and effect more rational policy outcomes. But under my leadership, what we are heading towards, the theme that I'm wanting to stress, is this idea of not pleading for the government to be better. You had Anthea Jeffrey on your show speaking about her excellent book, The Countdown to Socialism. The government is essentially run and operates on software which is essentially the National Democratic Revolution, Marxist-Leninist doctrine. And policy is downstream from this ideology. That is why we are seeing these very damaging effects of policy, whether it's Labour, BEE, EWC, NHI, you name it. So what organizations like ours are seeking to achieve is to change the parameters of the discussion, to really highlight the importance of an alternative set of ideas, rather than trying to implore the government to be better. We, unfortunately, are at a point where we don't think that submissions to Parliament, portfolio committees, or polite meetings with the minister over a cup of tea are really going to affect the change we need. But that requires creating alternative forms of power, which is a longer term project in which is incumbent on all South Africans to start to build themselves. And we are seeing it. I mean, you mentioned Gift of the Givers. I mean, that has huge popular goodwill. And that is performing a service which essentially many people would default to assuming that the state ought to provide, right? But the disaster relief that you get from Gift of the Givers is world class. And you can go through some of those other organizations as well. The private security industry in South Africa is a huge national asset that we need to protect, and is a lot more effective than the state police. So, I think where South Africa is heading is a bit unclear. But this idea of the center, Pretoria, calling all of the shots and setting the terms for the discussion, I think needs to come to an end. And as I stressed in the speech, organized business, big business, has a very important role to play. And one of the messages that I am conveying to big business is that it needs to withdraw its support. And if it is to offer continued support through partnership initiatives and so on, then it needs to impose certain conditions on that support. So this kind of blind support of government's agenda, these attempts to influence through backroom discussions, that is not working. We're still seeing these hostile policies on the legislative agenda. So big business needs to recognize its bargaining power, significant bargaining power. It has a lot more power than it thinks it has. It is in fact government that lacks the power. And so it's not just ordinary South Africans, individuals filling potholes. Big business needs to leverage its considerable resources, its know-how, and its expertise to fix some of these problems, but shouldn't rely on the government to be the leading actor. It can do these things on its own. Rather act first, and instead of trying to seek permission.
You sound a bit like Rob Hersov right now when you are talking about big business being part of the problem, not part of the solution. But just to kind of close off with, David, you don't end on a despondent, as you call it, disaster porn, avoid disaster porn note. Love that. Where do you get your optimism from?
Well, I get my optimism from the countless examples of ordinary South Africans coming together to solve problems themselves. And I do think generally, when observing South Africa, as Jan Smuts once said, South Africa is a place where neither the best nor the worst ever happens. And I think that that's quite true. But I think if you are over-optimistic or overly pessimistic, both of those extremes can lead to complacency and inaction. Those are not really action-oriented types of philosophies. So what I stress is a kind of a cautious optimism that has at its core a fundamental belief in the capacity of individuals to change their own circumstances. But you also need to fight for the freedom to do that. And there are other actors, unfortunately, that are trying to take that away from you, and specifically the government. And so you need to be very realistic about where the sources of your problems are. You need to be blunt in your analysis. But then you need to translate that into positive action to affect change in your immediate locus of control, your neighborhood, your street, your town, your city. And that is how we will change South Africa. But outsourcing it to the government and hoping that they will be better, and hoping that if you could just persuade them to adopt more market-friendly reforms, that somehow these problems will resolve themselves. That model might have worked in the past, but we're a long way off from that.
How many people think like you do?
Oh, Alec, my job is to encourage more people to think in this way. I think a lot of people are perhaps still wedded to the old model and are still hoping that there can be a turnaround. But I think the high watermark of that kind of thinking was in the run-up to President Ramaphosa's ascendancy to office. I think many people thought, well, here is potentially a reformer who could help to turn this ship of the ANC around. And I think many people have been gravely disappointed because of that attitude. And so I think there is, as I stress in the speech, this interregnum, this idea that there are many morbid symptoms. And in this interregnum, there is a lot of uncertainty. There is a lack of clarity about what is to come. So I quote Antonio Gramsci in that speech. And he says that the old is dying, but the new cannot yet be born. And I think we are in that kind of interregnum. We're not sure what the new formulation looks like, but we have seen that the emperor has no clothes, and that the legitimacy that the ANC government once had has been lost. But like I say, we as ordinary South Africans have to build that future that we want to see.
Don't outsource your thinking anymore. Take control, take command, make yourself part of the solution, not by wafting around being part of the problem. David Ansara is the Chief Executive of the Free Market Foundation, and I'm Alec Hogg from biznews.com.